You shall count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land. You shall make the 50th year holy, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee to you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee to you. In it you shall not sow, neither reap that which grows to itself, nor gather from the undressed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you, and you shall eat of its increase out of the field. In this year of jubilee each of you shall return to his property. But what does the Jubilee year outlined in Leviticus 25 have to do with the prophetic book of Isaiah? Perhaps a great deal. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons and Genesis. In the previous episode, we covered the first dozen chapters of Isaiah, so today we'll be picking up where we left off. Today's material can be divided into 2 sections. The first, chapters 13 to 23, is called the Oracles Against Other Nations, and the second, which is comprised of chapters 24 to 27, is the Isaiah Apocalypse. As the title implies, chapter 13 to 23 is a collection of oracles in which Yahweh makes known his displeasure with other nations such as Babylon, Moab, Syria, and Egypt. Chapter 13 to 14:23 concerns the nation of Babylon with mention of the returning exiles, placing it firmly within the post-exilic period, long after the time of Isaiah. The topic is the day of the Lord, when Yahweh will come to judge and destroy his enemies, meaning the enemies of his chosen land, as he's the patron deity of Jerusalem. In verse 4, Yahweh summons his heavenly army for battle, which earns him his name, Yahweh Sabaoth. They are summoned from the edges of heaven to destroy the entire world. The sun, moon, and stars will all go dark, and the entire world will be shaken. This is the origin of Mark's proclamation concerning the sun and moon going dark when the Son of Man returns in Mark 13:24, and the inspiration for the darkness at the crucifixion in Mark 15:33, Matthew 27:45, and Luke 23:44, though it could have come from other prophetic writings such as Joel and Zephaniah. This heavenly army is meant to represent the Medes, an Iranian people who would be conquered and absorbed into the Persian Empire. Yahweh's Median army will march on Babylon to destroy their army, dash their infants to pieces, and rape the women. Babylon shall become like Sodom and Gomorrah and will never again be inhabited by humans. Instead, it will become home to wild beasts and the Lilith, a kind of desert demon that flies around at night and terrorizes people in their sleep. What we have here in chapter 13 of Isaiah is a repurposing of an older tradition that originally concerned judgment on Israel. Amos 2 and 5, as well as Isaiah 2 through 4, mentions this concept of Yahweh judging the land, and Revelation 8 also gives us this pattern of Yahweh's angels bringing destruction and pouring out God's wrath, spreading desolation and darkening the celestial lights. Here in Isaiah 13, the oracle has been modified to repurpose this ancient tradition to serve as a warning against Babylon in order to explain the destruction that nation suffered at the hands of the Iranian invaders. Chapter 14 begins with a brief section concerning the restoration of Israel. The first few verses of the chapter specifically mention the return from the Babylonian exile, as Yahweh gathers up the nation of Israel and brings them out of exile to settle them in his chosen land, to give them rest from the turmoil of exile. This is immediately followed by an oracle about the fall of the mighty, as he is cast down to Sheol. A few interesting points of note in this section. First, while the introduction of the chapter specifically mentions the king of Babylon, the oracle itself lacks any mention of a specific king, meaning it's possibly a bit of temple mythology that's been repurposed to serve as an oracle against the Babylonian king. Why temple mythology? because verse 12 names the subject of this oracle, a son of God, who was cast down from heaven for the sin of attempting to usurp the throne of El Elyon. The oracle works quite well as a piece concerning Babylon, especially in light of their defeat at the hands of Cyrus, but in this context it describes a scene we're familiar with. A rebellious angel or lesser deity attempts to set up his own throne upon the highest point of heaven, which is equated with the peak of Mount Zaphon, the ancient name for Zion and the holy mountain of the patron god of Israel and of Canaan. His punishment for this betrayal is to be cast down into a darkened pit. The angel is equated not to the king of Babylon, but to all kings who rule over all nations. This might have originally been part of a nature renewal festival, in which an ancient king was symbolically stripped of his station to symbolize the onset of winter, and then was restored to glory to symbolize the return of fertility to the land in springtime. We touched on this in episode 34 when discussing the Babylonian festival of Zagmuk. This same theme will appear again in 1 Enoch, Psalm 82, and in Revelation 8, 9, and 20. And while this certainly could have originally been an oracle about the king of Babylon, it's important to understand the alternate meaning, that the fertility and success of a nation was linked with its ruler, and those rulers were the earthly embodiment of angels and stars. This is how they understood the universe and their place in it. Verses 24 to 27 contain a separate oracle concerning Yahweh's plan for the Assyrians and their invasion of 701 BCE. The foreign army shall be broken in the land of Yahweh as he stretches out his hand against them. The conclusion of chapter 14 is a bit out of order. The proper reading is verse 29, then 31, then 32, and then 30. The first two verses, 29 and 31, are an oracle against Philistia. Philistia will suffer for their actions, their revolt against Assyria, and fall to the Assyrians, so they have no reason to rejoice as the invading army approaches. Verses 32 and 30 are from the end of the damaged oracle and offer reassurance to the land of Judah. The messengers mentioned in verse 32 are the envoys sent from Philistia, attempting to persuade Judah to join in their revolt, but Isaiah encourages the king to keep faith in Yahweh, as he will keep them safe, as he promises the poor and needy a safe place to thrive. Chapters 15 and 16 contain the oracles against Moab. Dating this particular section is difficult with no agreement among scholars, though it's been suggested that the inspiration for the disaster which has befallen them might be inspired by the events of 2 Kings 14, in which Jeroboam II attacked Moab in the mid-8th century BCE. Another possibility is the Nabatean invasion in the 5th century BCE. The first verse of chapter 15 tells us the disaster befell the cities of Moab at night, their towns laid to waste. The residents shave their heads and beards and dress in sackcloth as a sign of mourning. Isaiah 15, 2-7 resembles Jeremiah 48, 35-38, with some phrases being copied verbatim, as the prophets both describe the wailing and mourning of Moab. Jeremiah 48, 29-33 will appear later in Isaiah 16, 6-11, as it discusses the pride of Moab. It's obvious one is copied from the other, but determining which is the original is still a matter of some debate. The oracle shifts gears in chapter 15, verse 7 to describe the refugees fleeing from Moab and seeking aid and protection from the king of Judah. This section, which begins with 15:7 and ends around 16:5, isn't duplicated in the book of Jeremiah like the sections which bookend it. The refugees go north, crawling on their bellies like reptiles, reminiscent of the serpent's punishment at the end of the Eden story. Verses 3-4 of chapter 6 instructs the people of Judah to take the refugees in to live among them, offering them shelter. We're then told that their humiliation and desperation was brought on by their own arrogance and pride, so the proud have been brought low. The oracle ends with a description of the beautiful terraced vineyards which were destroyed. The fertility of the land has been lost, and the prayers offered up in the high places didn't save them from destruction. Chapter 17 is divided into two parts. The first 11 verses concern Damascus and the Arameans. The final 3 verses are unconnected from the rest of the chapter and are concerned with the nation of Assyria and their attempt to invade Jerusalem. The chapter begins by stating that Damascus shall cease to be a city and become only a pile of ruins, forever abandoned. This may be a reference to the conquest of Tiglath-Pileser III in 732 BCE, when the city was conquered by the Assyrian emperor. But it was hardly destroyed and certainly never ceased to be a city, and it absolutely was not abandoned forever, as verse 2 claims. In fact, it's been continuously inhabited since the Bronze Age, and perhaps longer. Israel and Damascus had become allies 4 years prior to resist the Assyrian advance, though both nations eventually fell. Verse 3 tells us of the destruction of the Ephraimite fortress, and the glory of both Israel and Aram would fade. Little would be left behind, like remnants after the harvest. Again, we see Yahweh's judgment being likened to a crop harvest. On that day, the people of Israel would turn to Yahweh instead of the idols they've made and their Asherahs. The word Asherah can mean the wife of El Elyon, the queen goddess of heaven, but in this instance it's a reference to a carved wooden pole used in worship. There were Asherah poles for Yahweh and some which stood outside the Jerusalem temple. So the people will turn away from their improper means of worship and focus instead on their connection with Yahweh. This lays the blame for Israel's destruction on idolatry. Verses 12 to 14 are a reference to the Assyrians' defeat outside the walls of Jerusalem. If you don't recall that event, I'll refresh your memory. Sennacherib invaded Judah and besieged Jerusalem during the time of King Hezekiah. Hezekiah, not wanting to die, stripped the temple and palace of riches and paid the Assyrian king a healthy ransom and swore loyalty to him. This spared his city. Sennacherib then departed to continue his campaign, conquering multiple cities in the region and expanding his empire before eventually returning home years later. However, according to Deuteronomic theology, anyone who rose up against Jerusalem like that had to be punished by Yahweh. And since reality wasn't interested in doling out the retribution, the scribes took it upon themselves to correct reality's mistake. When penning the events of this siege in 2 Kings 19, they modified the events slightly. Hezekiah paid his ransom to the Assyrian king, but then Yahweh swooped down into the enemy camp and slew 185,000 soldiers. Of course, losing his entire army didn't stop the king from continuing his campaign of conquest or let Hezekiah off the hook. He was still a sworn servant of Sennacherib, and the Assyrian king would outlive Hezekiah by 6 years, despite what is written in the Book of Kings. You can find more information about this event in episode 64. So this section at the end of chapter 17 is a reference to that legendary event when Yahweh flew out over the walls of Jerusalem to attack the Assyrian soldiers camped outside. He goes out to rebuke them and drove them like chaff before the winds. He went among them like a terror, and by morning they were gone. Such is the fate of those who would plunder Jerusalem. Chapters 18 to 20 concern the nation of Egypt, which, like the Israelites and Arameans, also stirred up revolt among the vassal states of the Assyrians. At this point in Egypt's history, its 25th dynasty, the nation was ruled by Nubian pharaohs. They encouraged the likes of the Philistines to revolt against the Assyrians in 713 BCE and promised aid to Moab, Edom, and Judah if they joined in. The purpose was to use these nations as a sort of buffer against the Assyrians. They sent ambassadors to Judah who traveled there by boat, but the prophet tells them to return to their own people. Yahweh reminds them that he will bring his judgment against Assyria in his own time. A trumpet will blow to signal his judgment, which will come like a harvest, and the cutting of branches and pruning hook. Then gifts will be brought to Yahweh to his place on Mount Zion. The second oracle on Egypt comes in chapter 19 and begins with a vision of Yahweh riding on a cloud to visit Egypt and terrifying the idols they worship. So we not only have a reference to Yahweh as a non-omnipresent deity, but he hitches rides on clouds, just as the Canaanite Baal is said to have done in the Ugaritic text. We also saw this in Psalm 18 and Psalm 68. He sets out to incite civil war in Egypt, turning brother against brother, and raising up a cruel master to rule over them. This will be accompanied by drought that withers the crops, describing the type of disaster that occurs when the Nile's annual flood fails to arrive. An interesting point of note comes in verse 5 when the Nile is described as the sea, the Hebrew word yam. This is a Canaanite sea deity associated with chaos and destruction, an enemy of Baal and Yahweh. This repaints Yahweh's judgment against Egypt as a cosmic battle between the Israelite God and the primordial chaotic ocean. It's important to note that in the Ugaritic text, after Baal rides on a cloud and does battle with Yam and kills him, he then goes on to become king, the same title Isaiah elsewhere uses for Yahweh. What we're seeing here is an echo of the ancient Canaanite religion that served as the seed for Judaism. Yahweh confuses the wise men of Egypt who serve as counselors to the Pharaoh, reminiscent of the lying spirit sent by Yahweh for the same purpose in 1 Kings 22. The chapter ends with 5 short oracles, each one beginning with "on that day," covering verses 16 to 25. The first tells us that the land of Egypt will tremble with fear, and Judah will be a terror to them. The second tells us there will be 5 cities in Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear by Yahweh Sabaoth, and one city will be called City of the Sun, a reference to Heliopolis. The third oracle describes an altar to Yahweh with a sacred pillar in Egypt, near its border, and Yahweh will make himself known to the Egyptians, so they will make sacrifices to him, and he will fulfill those sacrifices. This is likely a reference to the border fortress of Elephantine in southern Egypt that housed a thriving Jewish community with its own temple that was connected to the temple in Jerusalem. Documents discovered there not only prove that the Jews had multiple temples to Yahweh, despite the Bible's insistence that only the temple in Jerusalem stood open, it was built to the same dimensions as the Jerusalem temple, 20 cubits by 60 cubits, and it also contained references to Yahweh's consort, the Canaanite war goddess Anat, who is likewise worshipped by the Elephantine Jews. The fourth oracle speaks of the Egyptians and Assyrians traveling back and forth through each other's lands, and the fifth and final oracle claims Israel will be a power equal to the Egyptians and Assyrians. What's curious is how Yahweh ends this chapter by stating Egypt will be his people, Assyria will be the work of his hands, and Israel will be his heritage. Chapter 20, which is only 6 verses, contains the last oracle about Egypt, warning Israel against trusting that particular nation. This one is a bit odd, as it begins with Yahweh instructing Isaiah to walk naked around the city for 3 years, behaving like a prisoner of war to demonstrate how the Assyrians would lead away the Egyptian captives. Personally, I think he could have just told them what would happen, and the residents of Jerusalem likely didn't need to be traumatized by seeing the old prophet strut around naked for 1,000 consecutive days. We're given 4 oracles in chapter 21. The first 10 verses tell of the fall of Babylon, and begins by calling it the wasteland by the sea, which is not very polite. It calls for Media to besiege Babylon and put an end to it. They see that Babylon has fallen and all their gods have been smashed on the ground. One point of note is from verse 2, when Yahweh sends the betraying betrayer and destroying destroyer up like a wind from the desert. This is a possible reference to desert demons from Canaanite mythology. Yahweh strolling in with demonic attendants to wreak havoc on his enemies can also be seen in Habakkuk 3:5. Verses 11 to 12 contain the oracle on Duma, an oasis in northern Arabia, or at least a fragment of an oracle. Yahweh is called from his home on Mount Seir, the Edomite mountain named for Jacob's brother Esau, and this isn't the first time that Yahweh is said to hail from this particular mountain. In some of the oldest stories in the Bible, Yahweh is linked with this region, and this may be a glimpse into his murky origins from a time before he had been merged with the Canaanite god Baal and moved to Mount Zaphon. Not much is said in this oracle, only that a watchman is posted in the night, but the oracle ends abruptly after he witnesses the dawn and another night. Verses 13 to 15 is the oracle in the steppes of Arabia. Again, we're in northern Arabia, where a nomadic tribe spends the night. They're told to bring water and food to fugitives that they meet as they have fled from battle. Finally, in the last two verses of the chapter, we have the oracle of Kedar, an Arabian tribe. It simply states that the glory of the tribe of Kedar will come to an end, and only a few of their archers shall remain. In chapter 22, things begin to get interesting as the prophet shares his vision of a great cosmic battle. This section, 14 verses, is entitled Oracle on the Valley of Vision. It may be a reference to Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem, which resulted in the stripping of riches from the city, as mentioned in 2 Kings 18-19, but that is uncertain. After Sargon II's death, Judah joined in revolt against the Assyrians and paid dearly for that mistake. The general message of this chapter is that trusting in one's allies instead of trusting Yahweh is a mistake. But the interesting part is how this message is framed, specifically in verse 8, which mentions a protective covering over the land of Judah, which Yahweh has removed for their lack of trust in him. People of the city were captured without a fight and now weep bitterly for turning their eyes from Yahweh. They've been routed and confused by Yahweh Sabaoth in the Hinnom Valley, which is west of Jerusalem, also identified as Gehenna, because they trusted in their allies, such as the Elamites and Arameans. So Yahweh removed this protective covering over the city and his land, a possible reference to the eternal covenant which protects the natural order of Yahweh's perfect creation. If this is damaged, destruction soon follows, and it's upon this concept that the Day of Judgment and Jewish eschatology is built. So this isn't just a local battle or siege of a city by the Assyrians, but a foreshadowing of the cosmic battle to come, which threatens all of creation. Yahweh called for weeping and mourning, but instead the people rejoiced and held great feasts, shouting, "Eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." The classic theme from the book of Ecclesiastes. See episode 79 for more on that topic. Because of this, Yahweh has decided that their behavior shall not be forgiven. The people were stockpiling weapons, water, and provisions, and gave no consideration for Yahweh, thus earning his fury. This idea of linking terrestrial battles with the cosmic strife between angels and demons will become the foundation of Christianity in later centuries, as conflicts between the Jews and Romans and theological disputes between various groups of Jews will be described as great wars between the forces of heaven and its demonic enemies. The remainder of the chapter is primarily concerned with palace politics and holds little of interest until we reach verse 22, where we're told that Eliakim, the master of the palace, will be clothed in new robes, and the sash which denotes his authority and master of the house of Judah. Upon his shoulder Yahweh will place the key of the house of David, and what he opens none shall shut, and what he closes none shall open. This will later be used to denote the faithful and true Jewish people, as opposed to those who follow false teachings. As with much of Isaiah, this section will later be retooled for use in Christian eschatology for the day of Yahweh, as we read in Revelation 3, 7-10. There are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. I know that you have little strength, yet you have kept my word, and have not denied my name. I will make those who are of the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews, though they are not, but are liars. I will make them come and fall down at your feet and acknowledge that I have loved you. Since you have kept my command to endure patiently, I will also keep you from the hours of trial that is going to come on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. Sennacherib attacked many coastal cities from 705 to 701 BCE, including the city of Tyre, providing inspiration for the oracle in Isaiah 23, though that's not the only possible origin for this material. A few decades later, under Esarhaddon, the area was also attacked, though it was Sidon which was destroyed. However, the Hebrew word for Sidon is similar to Tyre, so the two could have been easily confused during transmission. This city was also captured by the Persians in 343 BCE, and then the city of Tyre was besieged by Alexander the Great 11 years later, providing us with 4 separate events evenly distributed between the two cities, which could have all inspired the writing of this chapter. Whichever event was the basis, the Phoenicians had a coastal city wrecked by war, and chapter 23 was written to serve as a prophecy about that event sometime after it occurred. Personally, I believe it to be the earliest event, Sennacherib's attack on Tyre, because of the mention of the Assyrian conquest of Babylon in verse 13, which occurred around that same time. This section begins with, "Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for your port is destroyed." Their merchants, who crossed the sea with grain from Egypt, are ashamed, since the sea has spoken against their fortress city. Here in verse 4, the sea is personified, perhaps a reference to the sea deity Yam. Egypt shall be in anguish when they hear the report of the city's destruction, and ask who could have planned it. It was Yahweh who decreed its destruction, degrading its beauty. He stretched out his hand over the sea, and the harbor is no more. He tells them to look to the land of the Chaldeans, a people who have ceased to be, a possible reference to the Assyrian conquest of Babylon in 703 BCE. We're told in verse 15 that Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, and at the end of that time, the song of the prostitute will become the song of Tyre. What is the song of the prostitute, you might ask? Unfortunately, it's not fat-bottom girls. It's presented in verse 16. Take a harp, go about the city, forgotten prostitute, pluck the strings skillfully, sing many songs, that you may be remembered. Basically, whenever a biblical author is upset with a city, they call it a harlot, just as Jerusalem was called a harlot on a hilltop in Isaiah 121. The same would be said of Babylon and of Rome. Personally, as someone who prefers spending time in a more rural setting, I think equating a city with a prostitute is a bit unfair to the prostitute. At the end of this period, Yahweh will visit Tyre, and the city shall serve as a prostitute for Yahweh's people, meaning that Tyre will be a source of wealth and trade for them. We'll see more of this theme later in Isaiah as Yahweh sets up other nations and cities to serve Judah, such as in Isaiah 45:14. The last section we'll cover today is called the Apocalypse of Isaiah in chapters 24 to 27. If you're still on the fence about the idea that Isaiah and other apocalyptic Jewish literature is concerned with the concept of an eternal covenant being corrupted, which endangers creation, and the solution for that is a great judgment on the entire world framed as a harvest festival, which culminates in the enthronement of a king on Mount Zion, who is the representative of Yahweh, then let's take a look at chapter 24, which is entitled Judgment on the World and Yahweh's Enthronement on Mount Zion. This chapter deals with the collapse and destruction of the eternal covenant and its impact on the perfect creation and Yahweh's solution to the problem. It begins with his solution in verse 1. See, Yahweh is about to empty the earth and lay it waste. He will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. The proposed solution to a corrupt creation here in Isaiah 24 is the same as in Genesis. Destroy the entire thing and start over. He states that everyone will suffer this fate, regardless of their station in life. Buyer and seller, maid and mistress, people and priest. All are subject to his judgment. The entire world mourns and fades. The earth is polluted because of its inhabitants who have transgressed the law, violated the statutes, and broken the ancient covenant. This was God's commandments he gave to all the human race in Genesis 9 following the great flood. Because they have done this, they must pay for their guilt, as a great curse devours the world. Just as in the time of Noah, only a few remnants shall remain. Cheerful celebration comes to a quick end, and harps go quiet, as does the singing, and none shall drink wine. Joy and cheer has been exiled. Desolation rules the city that is battered to ruins. In verse 13, we're treated to our harvest imagery. As the olive tree is beaten and stripped, so too are the cities, now barren. The people will shout, "Therefore in the east give glory to Yahweh." His song comes from the ends of the earth, but people say, "I am wasted away, woe is me. The traitors betray with treachery." A reference to the betraying betrayers mentioned in chapter 21, these desert demons of Canaan who assist Yahweh in bringing destruction to his enemies. Those who flee his terror will fall into a pit, and those who climb from the pit will be caught in the trap, for the windows on high are open, and the foundations of the earth shake. This is a reference to the floodgates in the firmament that were opened to allow the sky ocean to flood the earth in the time of Noah. Remember, in Genesis 1, the primordial ocean was divided in half to allow the dry land to emerge, and half of the waters were placed above the firmament and held there. This is the threat to undo that and return the earth to its chaotic state before the orderly creation was established, the same process used in the time of Noah to wash away the corruption of the fallen angels and the Nephilim. The corrupt will fall, never again to rise, a reference to the rebellious angels' attempt to rise above El Elyon, which resulted in their punishment of being cast down to earth from their place in the heavens, and sealed away in a pit in the desert until such time that they'll suffer their fate. And if that connection seems like a bit of a stretch, the very next line, verses 21 to 22, removes all doubt. On that day Yahweh will punish the host of heavens in heaven and the kings of the earth on earth. They will be gathered up like prisoners into a pit, shut up in a dungeon, and after many days they will be punished. We covered all of this in the early episodes of Enoch, which examined the Book of Watchers. See episodes 48 and 49. The moon will blush and the sun will be ashamed. And finally, in the last verse of this chapter, we see the king's enthronement as Yahweh will reign from Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, in sight of the elders. This great vision of judgment, atonement, and renewal, which is linked with the harvest and enthronement of the king, echoes what we know of the ancient temple cult and its New Year festival, which in turn was similar to other ancient royal cults, such as that of Babylon, in which the divine king would battle the chaos monster, just as Marduk fought Tiamat, in order to renew the orderly creation. What we have here is more evidence that the same brand of mythology which permeated much of the Mediterranean world also formed the foundation of Jewish theology. This vision is interrupted by a brief hymn in the beginning of chapter 25, which praises Yahweh for his deliverance, the long-awaited fulfillment of ancient plans. The cities of his enemies have been destroyed, causing powerful nations to fear him. He provides refuge and shelter to the poor. The oppressive heat he subdued with storm clouds, using his rain to vanquish tyrannical enemies, which brings us another connection between Yahweh and the storm god Baal. The original version, which left off in chapter 24, continues in chapter 25, verse 6, picking up with Yahweh on his mountain, promising to provide for his people as the order is being restored and creation is being set right. The victory is celebrated with a great feast, and the protective veil which has been lifted away from Jerusalem has now been restored. Yahweh then destroys death, and the people rejoice that he is their God who has saved them. This sequence will go on to play an important role in the foundation of Christianity, as the destruction of the temple veil, which symbolizes the removal of the divider between the mortal world and heaven, is used in the crucifixion narrative followed by Jesus, playing the role of Yahweh, who defeats death through his sacrifice and saves the people, prompting them to reach the conclusion that he is indeed linked with God. Hebrews 10:19-21 explains this link. The vision sequence is interrupted again in verses 10 to 12 when the editors insert a bit on Moab. The hand of Yahweh rests against Moab, which will be trodden, and Moab will be brought low, its fortresses destroyed for their pride. Again, the sin of Moab is pride, and the punishment is to be cast down, the same theme seen in 1 Enoch with the Watchers. The vision picks up again in chapter 26, continuing the praise of Yahweh for his deliverance with a song, which was likely part of their worship. The strength of Jerusalem is mentioned, and they proclaim their trust in Yahweh forever, as he is considered to be their eternal rock. The lofty are brought low, and the way of the just is made smooth and level, taken from Proverbs 11:3-5. We learn that they seek Yahweh at dawn, another reference to his appearance at sunrise, linking him with solar worship. Fire consumes Yahweh's enemies, which is the fate of the Watchers mentioned in the first section of Enoch and part of Yahweh's plan to restore the creation, following its corruption. His enemies are shades in Sheol, unable to rise and erased from memory. But the faithful dead shall live, rising up from the dust to be restored. While this section will later be used by Christians to reference the resurrection of saints, it's a promise to restore the population of Judah and Israel following their many crippling defeats and deportations at the hands of their enemies. The author isn't talking about a literal resurrection of the dead, but a symbolic one. It's the nation that is in the dust, and it shall one day be restored. However, it should be pointed out that there did exist at this time a belief that the righteous could return to life, reborn as sons of God, and take their place among the stars of heaven as angels, though it likely only applied to kings and priests. Yahweh responds to his people, instructing them to hide themselves in their homes behind locked doors and allow his wrath to pass as he goes forth from his home and moves through the earth to punish the wicked. The earth will reveal the slain, no longer hiding the blood which was spilled by evildoers. This theme was first seen in Genesis with the story of Cain and Abel, when Abel's blood cried out from the ground to alert Yahweh to Cain's crime. It was seen again in the story of the Watchers when the Nephilim began to slaughter the people, and the cries of their blood reached all the way to the heavens, alerting the archangels, who brought their plight to God. War and bloodshed is a corruption of the perfect creation, and that spilled blood cries out for justice. The response from Yahweh is to exit his mountaintop dwelling and visit his wrath upon the enemies of his people, as the innocent hide in their homes. This is, no doubt, part of the inspiration from the scene added to Kings and Isaiah when Yahweh goes out to kill the Assyrians who besieged Jerusalem, and for the later Passover story found in Exodus. This section of Isaiah concludes with chapter 27 and culminates with the Day of Judgment. Yahweh, depicted as a god of war brandishing a sword, comes to punish his enemies, who are depicted as Leviathan, the great sea dragon of the primordial chaotic ocean. This echoes the battle in the Ugaritic text and the story of Marduk and Tiamat in the Enuma Elish, upon which Genesis 1 is based. An interesting note here is that the description of Leviathan is not only copied from a story involving Baal's battle with the sea dragon in the Ugaritic text, but its mention as a crooked serpent is the same description we have for Nehushtan, the serpent god mentioned in the Eden story, meaning there were some traditions which linked Leviathan and the Eden serpent, considering them both to be the same entity. After Yahweh battles the dragon, we see a description of him acting as a rain god, watering the vineyards, a reference to the deity bringing fertility to the land, typical of a patron god associated with storms and fertility, as is also the case with Baal. He promises the land of Israel a future in which they will flourish, a land blossoming with fruit. Yahweh's judgment will be the expiation of Israel's guilt and removal of sin, the sin of idolatry, as it is linked with hilltop shrines and altars as well as Asherah poles, a sign that the nation's sins have been atoned. Finally, in the last 2 verses of the chapter, we complete the imagery with the expected blowing of trumpets and mention of the grain harvest. The ingathering of the harvest is linked with the gathering of the scattered exiles, and the trumpet suggests that this occurs during a Jubilee year, according to Leviticus 25:9, a time when the land was to return to its original owners, just as the exiles would return to their ancestral home. We'll see this pattern again in Revelation 21 when the day of judgment destroys evil and chaos in order to bring about a new creation and a new world for the chosen people. In short, a new Jubilee. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.